He was a person who had this incredible sense of peace and quietness. You could see him thinking without making any judgments, and he thought very widely about lots of things. I met him through his wife, Margaret. She introduced me to him with the view that I could possibly help with some of the elements of the garden. I kind of sense that the house and the garden reflects that sense of no ego projecting into any of the constructions that he was involved in, even the planning of the spaces. A lot of the early landscape designers like Hill and Massey didn't have any formal design training, but they had a leaning towards appreciation of design through reading. And one of the most published of the early Australian designers was Edna Walling. And when we looked at the drawings of Hill, of this garden, it's very reminiscent of a Walling plan. Even though the garden was laid out on the grid that we see on the drawing, it was really in a sense a guide for the spaces. But then the overlay that Massey and Hill put onto a lot of their gardens was very much a natural landscape. So they used the grid as a reference point, but it became, in a sense, a change with nature breaking the grid down. I think Doley came from that sense of designers that sought a sense of order in form and proportion. But as soon as they met nature, when they tried to put the form and proportion into the setting, they found that nature was starting to break down the rules. It took them a long time to accept the fact that you were partly in control at the beginning, but in the end you had to go with nature. And particularly when you look at this particular garden, where First Creek is its spine, but it's a very free form, almost like an S shape. And I think they would have struggled with how to express that. But I think Doley was able to realise that it wasn't as important to be specific in every area, but in a sense to start to understand how to appreciate how to fit this house into the site. And when you look around, it's predominantly got 4 major eucalypt groups that he's snuggled the house into. He reflected and respected the red gums as the dominant anchor points for both the house and the terrace. Something which very few architects and designers did in the early days. And that's why I think this house represents more of the Northern European relationship with landscape. When you work in a woodland like this, you have to take your cues from people who've done it before, and the Northern Europeans often worked in woodland settings. So I think Doley probably would have driven the design more than the landscape designers, Robin Hill, but I think he would have deferred to them in terms of plant species. But at that point, I don't think any of them would have appreciated the significance of the creek and the power of the creek, in the sense that it completely defined that garden as a wild woodland garden that you couldn't fiddle with. There was 2 schools of thought that were coming into modernism in that period of time, from say the 1920s to the 1950s, where there was the natural school and there was the formal school. In Australia, they all came back, when you have a successful garden, into the natural. So a person like, Edna Walling would have picked up the natural ability of us working with different kinds of light, different kinds of plant species. The genius of this house is how you're always aware completely of the landscape that you're sort of sitting in. There's very little sense of being able to kind of feel that there's a man-made element here which is intruding. It completely floats with the woodland and the connection with the woodland. But also tactilely, it's a sound of water. The fact that they could open and close rooms to get that sense of sound and the sense of birds and the wind through the leaves, etc. It was sort of the music of the garden was quite genius of its time.